Well, I remember the first time I ever heard that everything around us was made out of these elements that consisted of little particles called atoms. I remember, I was probably somewhere between second and third grade, and I was trying to understand this. Because when they talked about the atom, I remember that presenter, where I just happened to be and listen with the adults, saying that the atom was actually mostly hollow. And so I thought, well, if I'm made of a bunch of these little particles that stick together, who knows how, by these special forces that attract each other, and these particles have little holes in them, then why do I pour water in my hand or in a cup and it doesn't flow through? And then I thought, what will happen? And I literally remember thinking that, what will happen if for whatever reason that force that holds the atoms together falls apart? I'll become a pile of atoms rolling all over the place. And then I remember growing up and learning that, see, even though we're all made of these little particles, which are a lot more complex than we can even imagine, there was a designer who put them all together to stay and stick, so my fears will never materialize. See, I remember as I was learning later on, and by the way, I loved physics, and then I remember taking my first chemistry class when we started to study about all these amazing things, and it was so cool, and I loved it for 2 years, and then the teacher switched. The lady that was teaching left. By the way, how many of you, let me ask this, love chemistry? Okay, how many of you, I'm not gonna say hate it, but can stand it? All right? It's not about not being good. You know what I remember is this teacher, my favorite teacher in chemistry, left, and a new teacher came in, and for whatever reason, I just could not stand the class anymore. She made it so hard and dry and unclear that I still got a good grade because I had to read and learn, but it just was not my really favorite class. Sometimes the things we relate to could be presented to us in the wrong way, right? But yet, even though the teachers changed and the way I learned about things changed and my attitude towards chemistry changed, not towards physics, I remember that the world didn't change. Because see, when God created the elements, He created them to stay stable. Because everything is made out of that. I remember learning about this chart that you see on the screen. What do we call it? A periodic table. We used to call it actually the Mendeleev table, which is really the guy who kind of put it all together. By the way, this Russian guy in Mendeleev, who put it all finally together, even though they didn't have all the elements in place, he lived in Siberia. And I remember, reading about that, and we used to joke that the reason why he invented this is he had nothing else to do when you go through 6 months of just frozen ground and there is nothing else really to occupy yourself with. But nevertheless, he created it. It's good. We understand life better, but it also made our school life a lot harder. Amen? Where are all the students, right? Do you remember having to memorize all those in order? I had to learn them, and I know I used to know them, and I cannot recite, half of them now if I had to, but I know here in US, my son learned them through a song. It was a lot better way to learn it. I wanted him to sing it, but then he said, no, I'm not doing that. All right. So anyway, God created each one of these elements in a particular way. By the way, just really brief, we're not going to dig too deep into this, but just really, really briefly, what defines what place each element will take? They're all numbered, by the way. From 1 to 100 are the natural elements, and then from 100 on, those of you who know chemistry, those are elements that are forced together or designed artificially, whatever. So what defines which box will each element go into? All right, so what happens is the electron has 3 parts, right? And that's all. I'm not a scientist, by the way, okay? But just because we're going to come back to this throughout the next 7 lessons, we're going to talk about 7 lessons we'll learn from the wonderful way God created this earth, and particularly the elements. We need to have a basic understanding. There are 3 parts: protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, those of you who are chemists and understand it better. Protons, what creates and what does the nucleus, that little part in the middle, consist of? Protons and neutrons, right? And the number of protons defines the number that the atom will have on the periodic table. Neutrons could change, and I am not going to venture into that before I'm ready to do so, of what you call that. The electrons that are orbiting, those little things that you see orbiting around, especially for the kids, those are the electrons. They change, but the protons never do. If a proton, the number of protons changes, what happens to the element? It goes to a totally different kind. I mean, that's why it's kind of pointless. You don't change elements, okay? Because you just, there are elements out there. So, remembering this, God creates things with a purpose. But He also created them with stability, with consistency. Because the element doesn't change. It might get off balance from time to time. It might lose some particles and gain others. But the actual element does not change. I remember it's been a few months back. We were sitting around our dining table with few friends from church. Nedra was there. And she will remember that we talked about all these, amazing ways that God created the elements and the characteristics, and all of a sudden, we all said, man, we can learn so much of this. There is so many parallels between the elements in God and life and humanity that maybe we should look into this. And so it gave the beginning of this idea of what's going to be 7 lessons that we're going to learn over 7 weeks about, again, God, life, humanity, salvation, and so on. But when God creates, you can see His fingerprint in His creation. Why? I am sure that all of you, if you kind of think about your life back, and even now, you find yourself doing things and you say, man, that's exactly what my dad did, or that's exactly what my mom used to say. Why am I doing the same thing? You remember that? Or have you had someone look at you and say, hey, oh, you look exactly like your dad, or oh, you speak exactly like your mom. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but we are copy. We tend to reflect on the ones who gave us life and who raised us. It's the same thing with God. See, the creation of God is his part of His heritage. And His fingerprints are all over. So when we look at the way the universe is made, we realize and learn insights about who God is. And just like some things you cannot break down, at least not in a natural way. Remember the teacher saying that no matter how many times you cut an object or a fruit or whatever you're cutting with a knife, you can never, we're talking about just under normal conditions, you'll never cut an atom in a half. You will break the other connections between the molecules, but never cut an atom in a half. As I was, reflecting on all that and the consistency of the elements, I thought, what a better picture than to discover some of the qualities of God. And the first one of those will be that God never changes. God is always consistent. He might adapt and react to certain ways to help us, to reach out to us, but the designer of the body, of the water, of this platform, of everything around us, this world and the universe, He designs things to keep certain consistency, to follow certain laws, because that is what provides the stability out there. It is interesting. once again that God is the God of the elements, and the elements reflect on His character. It was in one of those evenings when David was sitting down on this rock. The flocks were around him, the sheep were asleep, and he was staring, gazing at the sun and the sky. I can almost imagine how he must have felt, because I remember as a little kid when we went camping every year with our church family, right by the campground, we used to go to the same place up in one of the most beautiful mountains in Bulgaria. And there is this huge rock that you can climb on top of. And we'll climb there with my friends late at night, and we'll look up and we'll try and spot satellites. Have you ever done that? Those stars that move, that are not real stars, but we didn't know much about it. We're just looking for these moving stars until we learn what they are. But I remember there were a couple of times when my friends and my parents are with us, and at a certain point, just as we're gazing into all this and looking at the beautiful night sky, someone will just break out in a song. Have you ever done that? Being so inspired by a view, beautiful scenery that you saw, or nature, that you didn't have to hear a Bible verse. You didn't have to really have someone tell you how beautiful it is. You just started singing a song that praises God. It just came out of you. Some of you have experienced that. You know what I'm talking about. My wife, by the way, loves doing that when we're out in nature. She'll just break out in singing. Sometimes we'll have tears in our eyes. This was David looking at the nightly sky. And as he was looking, he wrote this psalm, Psalm 19. Open your Bibles with me into Psalm 19. Find it on your devices and just keep it on there. We're going to jump to a few other texts, but the primary text we will stay in will be Psalm 19 for today. And here is how David describes God looking at the creation. Psalm 19, we're going to start reading verses 1 through 3. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 3. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Some translations might, instead of the speech, they will say there were no words that they were saying. And yet their voice, their words are heard all over. So here is David once again looking at the sky. And then during the day being out in nature with the flocks and the sheep and looking at the beautiful animals and the scenery out there, from one of the high hills. And this song comes out of him. By the way, all the Psalms, most of you who are familiar with the Bible know, were songs. They were praise music. And David wrote over 70 of those Psalms. From what we can tell, this was written pretty early in David's life. In fact, it is believed that when David wrote this song, he hadn't yet become a king. He was anointed by God, from at least what we can tell, even though the psalm doesn't give us a lot of details. He was anointed by Samuel to be a king. Remember that? Samuel goes there, says, God has chosen you to be the next king, but Saul is still the king of the land. And so David just continues to do his thing humbly, waiting for the moment when he will be the king. And what happens in the story is Saul ends up calling David to play for him. Do you remember that? Because Saul had this evil spirit, because he had gone so far away from God, that evil spirit was now bothering him. And when David will come and play for Saul and sing, David was a a great musician. And that Saul will feel so calm. So imagine David knowing that he is the next king, knowing that he should be in the throne, that this guy is still sitting, but knowing that God hasn't taken him out yet. And then going through times when he was persecuted by Saul. Saul tried to kill David on a few occasions because he was jealous about David. Especially after David defeats Goliath. And then we read that David at one point was sitting in a cave and Saul comes in there, and David could have taken Saul's life, and David says, I cannot lift my hand against the God's anointed person. Because David knew that the creator of the universe, the one that the heavens and the skies declare, whose glory the heavens and the skies declare, was the one who knew best the way, the path for his life journey. And he trusted God with that. And here is he now writing this psalm, going through experiencing all this, pressure of fear, of his life being threatened, of faith, of admiration for God, of, trying to deal with his own growth, personal growth. He wasn't a perfect guy, and he's writing, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. And now verse 3 again. I want to go to verse 3 and 4 one more time and read these two together. There is no speech or words or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. What David is saying is, when nature speaks, you don't need words, right? It is so, we call this inspiration, when you just look at nature and you're filled with this awe about God. That's what we call inspiration. We have all felt those moments. And so David is saying, really seeing God in nature is one of the best ways to get to know God. Theologians call that the general revelation. In fact, in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and on, the book of Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and on, we read Apostle Paul in the New Testament sharing a similar idea. Before that, he talks how God hates evil and how his wrath, by the way, when you read about the wrath of God, the anger of God, it's always targeted towards the evil, not towards people. But, Paul is sharing how before and after this text, we're going to read how people have walked away from God. And now, in this part, verses 18 and 19, he says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heavens against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. And now listen how in verse 20. Let's put verse 20 on the screen. Give you a second. Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so people are without excuse. David in the Old and the New Testament, Paul here, say that, hey, when you look at nature, you can learn so much about God. The same idea we talked about as we mentioned the elements. The way God put everything together in a wonderful and miraculous way is the same way that will reflect his character and the qualities, the attributes of God that we learn to admire. So David, in Psalm 19 again, says, you want to learn about God? Do you want to live a life where you know who made you and how you were made and why you were made? Then turn your eyes towards the heavens and the skies. By the way, when you read the heavens and the skies, there are those two expressions. These expressions actually made you think back or should make you think back of a particular moment in human history. And that was the moment of creation. The skies and the heavens were there. It was this vault. In fact, the actual word that the Bible uses there was a vault, a place with space. And in that, God's glory is revealed through the creation that He did. See, the heavens declares the glory of God. They speak without words because nature reveals God, who He is, how He creates, and His power and abilities. God never changes. He creates laws to sustain the universe and everything around us. By the way, for a long time, the church used to teach that the earth is flat. You know, when you read the scriptures, especially the verse in Job 26, 7 and 8, and then we're going to read Isaiah 40, 22 as well. But let's go first to Job 26, verses 7 and 8. Just listen to how the Bible describes the earth. May my enemies be like the wicked, my adversaries like the unjust. For what hope has the godless when he is cut off, when God takes away his life? Does God listen to... wait a second, I'm not reading the right place. I'm a chapter ahead. Job 26, 7 and 8. He spreads out the northern skies over empty space. He suspends the earth over nothing. He wraps the waters in his cloud, yet the clouds do not burst under their weight, and so on. But the whole idea is the earth is suspended on nothing, is what God says. And then in Isaiah 40, 22, Isaiah 40, 22 is another text that we have looked at before. And it says, He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in, and so on. But again, here in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, God says that He stands over the circle of the earth. And by the way, you know, there used to be this argument, what is a circle? It could mean a flat circle, or it can mean a sphere. But when you look at the Hebrew word, a lot of times it is used, again, with the same idea as we mentioned in Genesis 1 as a vault, which implies three-dimensionality. So here, when you really read the context, most Bible scholars agree that this refers to a sphere. See, God gave, even in the scriptures through the prophets, an insight into how He created everything, into how He made it, because He wanted people to learn about Him through nature. So what does that say? If you can hang things on nothing, if you can take elements, little elements that you cannot break in natural ways, and connect them, and they all connect in the right way, if you're here during the children's story, they don't mix randomly. Under normal circumstances again, then that same God is in control of everything. The same way He had the power to tell the elements where to go, to create the heavens and the earth, to create us, to the same way He holds those connections that keep the elements together without them breaking. God, the same way, is consistent and has the answers to your and my life. See, God does not change. Malachi chapter 3, verse 6 is another place where one of the Bible prophets speaks about that. Malachi chapter 3. Verse 6, and the verse says, I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. You know what is very interesting now in where Malachi takes us, and we'll go back in a second to Psalm 19, But what Malachi says, because I'm consistent, God says, because I'm consistent in my attitude towards you, in my love towards you, you are not destroyed. See, if it wasn't for God's consistency, for His unchanging and unshaking love towards us, we will most probably not be here. Have you ever thought of why God kept Adam and Eve after they sinned? What was the good in it? The only good was that God is a God who will always love us, no matter what, like a parent loves their child. For God is a God of relationships. And by the way, it's very interesting because that's exactly where David goes in Psalm 19. Let's go to Psalm 19 now, and we will read verses 5 and 6. Okay? Psalm 19, verses 5 and 6. And it says this. I'm sorry, we'll go back to the last line of chapter 4, because the way the verses break there, they don't break it exactly where the end of the paragraph should be broken. So the last part of verse 4 says, in the heavens He has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heaven and makes its circuit to the other, and nothing is hidden from its heat. Interesting picture here of the sun, where the sun is presented as God has pitched this tent. And this is just a typical expression. In the ancient time, the sun was one of the gods, the most revered gods. Any literature you read, you will remember, for the Egyptians, that was the Ra god. For the Mesopotamians, it was Marduk. But all of these gods, they had something to do with representing the sun. They were either the god of the sun, or they were a child of the god of the sun. And here David says, now, knowing that all the people are familiar with this idea, and by the way, all of the gods of the ancient times, they had their temple or tents. They had a place to dwell. Now David comes and says, oh, by the way, you know that God you all believe in? The sun god? Oh, it's God who pitches its tent. All of your gods really don't measure up to my God. He's the one who designs everything, even the sun and the world around us. The universe is all submissive to Him. Not only that, but then he continues and says, and the sun now, in verse 5, is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion. Again, at that time, during a wedding ceremony, the bridegroom will have this special place. It's usually a tent, or if it was a stone house, you'll have a particular room, and that's the place where the marriage will happen, and then it will be consummated. It was the chambers of the bridegroom were this special place where the most close relationships were actually established. The relationship between husband and wife, families began there. When you read this, David is saying, hey, by the way, God not only created the sun and He's over all of our gods, but God is also the one who has and longs to have intimate relationship with His creation. Like in a marriage, God wants to be with His people. God wants to be with His creation. And isn't that true? God could have existed on His own, right? Build only things that will serve Him. If it was up to me, I'll build my Formula One track, I'll build my soccer field, I'll build my chocolate fountain, and that's it. I don't need you guys to interfere with my life, right? That's the human way of thinking. Maybe I'll create some of my best friends. And I know some of you are looking and saying, yeah, and you're not going to be in my world either, right? Because we're people. We do things the way God says, you know what? I don't do things just to please me. I want to interact with them, but I create them with a free will so they have a choice if they want to be with me. And God created the human beings. And we know that Satan walked away from God, which means that Satan had free will. We know that Adam and Eve walked away from God because God created us with free will because of you. But God also loves you enough to, when you feel lonely, to provide a community for you. If you ever feel lonely, just look up to God. Say, God, would you reach out to me? Would you come and just walk alongside of me because I feel scared, because I feel alone? And God will do that, because God, who never changes, longs to take away your fear, and live in a community with you. Then Psalm 19 continues. And it switches into a different part. We're going to Psalm 19, verse 7. David now switches the whole, direction he was going right here. Psalm 19, and we're going to read verse 7 all the way through verse 11. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. And the decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold. See, God didn't just create us and leave us alone, but God also, this text tells us, created also His law. And by the way, the word law here does not refer in the Old Testament just to the 10 Commandments the way we tend to apply it. It refers to the whole Torah, to all 5 books of Moses, which include the history, the creation, the relationships, and all the other instructions that God is giving. And now David says, and by the way, this law, and he gives 12 characteristics of that law. He says it's perfect, trustworthy, right, radiant, pure, firm. It's refreshing, makes one wise, gives joy and light, endures forever, and is righteous. When you hear that, do you hear David's call? That says not only that God wants to be with you, but God also has given you the instructions of the manual of how to live a better life. Don't you want to listen to the Creator who designed the heavens and the earth and puts the sun in its place and in its orbit and all the stars and heavenly bodies, who designed the elements that make you? Don't you want to listen to the very one who knows what's best for your life? For the law of the Lord, David says, is perfect, refreshing, trustworthy, right, radiant, pure, and firm. Listen to God. And when we feel confused in life, when we are at a moment when we just don't know what to do, when we are facing questions that are too big for us to know the answers to, God says, don't worry, you are not alone. I'm the God, the all-powerful God who doesn't change, who still loves you, who will be along your side, who longs to be in a relationship with you, who will give you the wisdom and the words through my instructions of how you can go forward so things will not fall apart. And in the very last part of this text that we are finishing with, then David gets to this 5th area. And he says, and by the way, if you mess up from the direction I have given you, if it just happens that you go astray and your life starts falling apart because you've messed it up, here is what I will do. Again, here is what God does. Psalm 19, we're going to read verse 12 and 13. Psalm 19, verses 12 and 13. And it says, but who can discern their own errors? Now David looks and says, you gave us the law, you gave us the direction, and by the way, the law makes me righteous. If I follow it, means I will be good, I will do the right things, I will have a better life. But who can know, David says, who can discern their own errors? By the way, that word errors really means to commit a misleading act. It's the same word that is used when you're intoxicated and you don't have a good judgment. You just mess up in your judgment of the steps that you should take. David says, God, but we are not wise enough always to know what to do. And then he goes and he says, forgive my hidden faults. Have you ever prayed that? I remember there was a pastor who once said, you got to confess every sin that you have ever done to God, otherwise you're not going to heaven. And that's not biblical, but I remember hearing it as a kid, and I'm like, man, God, what if I forgot something? And when you're a kid like me, there were a lot of sins to remember. I remember, feeling afraid. God says, and David says, don't worry about it. Is your heart wanting to be with me? Even the sins that you did, you did because of bad judgment, those that are hidden faults that you haven't even realized, David says, God, please forgive them. And God, in Malachi 7, 18 through 20 says, I will take all of those sins. By the way, using the same two words of sin that are here are used in Malachi. And Malachi says, we are not going to go to the text, but it says, and God will take my iniquities and sins and transgressions and throw them into the depths of the sea. He will restore our relationship with Him. But then David in verse 13 says, and by the way, it's not only the hidden faults, God, but he also says, keep your servant also from willful sins. The Hebrew words of willful here are sins, the hatah sins, the sins that are caused by open rebellion. I know what I'm doing, but I'm going to go and do it anyway. I am going to be arrogant and proud. And David says, God, I know I have moments like that in my own life. And by the way, God didn't let David build his temple. Because he said, you know what, David? Just so you don't think you're a little bit better than everyone else, I'm not going to let you do it. Because you have pride in your heart that have led you many times to act against me. And yet God said, but I forgive you. And David says, okay, would you please keep your servants from the willful sins? And that expression, keep, is, protect me. Don't let me go into willful sinning. And then he says that so it may not rule over me. And then continues, then I will be blameless and innocent of the great transgression, which is the next word used for sin. And those transgressions are really sins, things that we do that break the trust between us. Anything that we do that breaks the trust between God is encompassed in that word for sin, transgression, translated as transgression there in verse 13. And by the way, when David says, I'll be innocent, the Hebrew word there says it is God's act of clearing me up, of rebuilding that gap, that brokenness that has appeared in the trust, reestablishing the connection, being acquitted, being declared free because someone paid your price. God creates everything so beautifully that even when the elements of nature sometimes try to hurt us because they've been affected by sin, or when we walk against God's will because we have been affected by sin, because we are part of those creations from those elements that sin has affected, even if we do that, God says, I am here to declare you innocent. When you fail to follow God's instructions, willingly or just because it happens, remember that the God who doesn't change, who still will not only still love you, but He wants to declare you innocent. He wants to give you His righteousness. He wants to bring His peace. He wants to recreate you back and put those elements in the place where they were supposed to be. And as we will see, sometimes elements tend to go weird and do weird things, but you know what happens over time? They get back to their normal state. For God designed everything to be under His control. God designed everything, therefore He can protect you no matter what you're experiencing. God designed everything, therefore He gave us instructions on how to follow Him and how to have a better life. And because God never changes and designed everything, He says, even if you mess up, I know how I can put you back together and make you righteous once again. And the last verse of chapter 19 that we'll finish with says, may the words of my mouth, this is David praying again, and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my God and my Redeemer. As we get ready for the closing song, I want to challenge you. Will you love God the way He loves you? Will you never give up on God the way He doesn't give up on you? Will you keep your hopes high? Because He keeps His hopes high for you. And will you let Him restore you back even when you are broken? Because He longs to make you righteous once again. See, God can do all these things because it is His intervention in my life that transforms me and changes me. And He wants to do that for you too. Would you let Him?